Now, there are times when a piece of music comes along that it's so significant to a movement that they seem to define an era or certainly create an archetype for it. And today's analysis looks at one of those pieces. It's my pleasure to welcome staff bandsman Jonathan Evans to Fully Scored to speak about Dean Goffin's The Light of the World. Well, Jonathan Evans, trombone, thank you ever so much for joining us today on Fully Scored. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. And you're going to be speaking about The Light of the World, Dean Goffin's classic work, is that correct?
Yes, I'm very excited to be talking about it and feel quite honoured considering it's such an iconic and well-loved piece as well.
Yeah, absolutely no pressure. 2 times voted top of the Sammy Music Index Hall of Fame. But again, no pressure at all. So, shall we delve in?
Let's.
So, before we look at the score, I've got a few contextual questions perhaps you could illuminate us with. Could you tell us a little bit about when this piece was written and perhaps some of the story behind it?
Yeah, well, with this piece, you really need to go back to the painting of the same name by Holman Hunt, which was first produced in 1854. There are 3 versions of it. The original hangs at Oxford University in Keble College. There was a second version that is a smaller version, which is in Manchester Art Gallery, just around the corner from me, and something I like to go and see from time to time. And then the third and final version is perhaps the most famous, the life-size version in St Paul's Cathedral. Probably one of the most viewed paintings in history because it went on a world tour in 1906, seen by 2 million people. It was evacuated in the Second World War, such was its importance. And that's probably the one that people think of, but that was actually the third version. Now, the painting features the figure of Jesus wearing a crown of thorns and appearing with marks of nails in his hand. He's standing patiently outside a door, knocking with one hand, holding a lantern with the other. This is symbolic, and the door represents the door of our lives, the door to our heart. Jesus knocks on the door. He waits patiently for us to open it up. Crucial to the painting is that the door has no handle. The only way for it to be opened is from the inside. A person who hears Jesus' message, they need to accept it and open their life to admit him. Now, in all of the paintings, there's an inscription from Revelation 3:20 written beneath the picture, which reads, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and sup with him, and he with me." And that is the inspiration behind Hunt's painting. There are lots of details which we'll delve into, some of which come out in the music. Now, Dean Goffin viewed this as a 14-year-old at St Paul's Cathedral in the spring of 1931. He had a 6-month period travelling through Europe with his father. And it's interesting to note that St Paul's Cathedral was an important place for Dean Goffin because in the centenary celebrations in 1965, he closed those celebrations by conducting a performance of the Messiah. So that cathedral is a very important place for him as well. That trip as a 14-year-old was very significant. Dean Goffin at that point had largely been uninterested in music, despite being the youngest son of a well-known Salvation Army musician, Brigadier Henry Goffin. Now, he was a well-known composer, particularly of marches. Listeners will probably be familiar with the Red Shield, which is his most famous march. Well, his son Dean met Eric Ball during that trip, which was very significant for him. He attended lots of large Salvation Army music events, and perhaps apart from seeing the painting The Light of the World, most pivotally, he went to a BBC Proms concert, and he saw a performance of the Planets suite, which was significant because it was the first time that Gustav Holst himself had conducted that piece. Dean referred to it as a cultural and spiritual landmark in his life, and Holst became a hero for him. So following the trip, music became important in his life, and he went back to New Zealand. By 19, he was bandmaster at Wellington South. He then, during the Second World War, was a military bandmaster. He was writing music for his band, including an early version of Anthem of the Free, the march that we know as a Salvation Army march. There was a military band version first. Following the war, he completed a music degree, and during his studies, he decided to enter an international Salvation Army devotional composition competition. And he worked on 2 pieces that we would now know as The Light of the World and also the Gospel Story. And he was doing that in 1946. But really interestingly, neither of those pieces were actually accepted due to some kind of technicality. We don't actually know what that technicality was, though we might want to guess at some of the reasons. And it didn't proceed far enough to get to the attention of Branwell Coles. Well, a couple of years later, Eric Ball, who he'd met on that trip as a teenager, he selected Goffin's Rhapsody in brass for the British Open test piece up in Manchester in 1949. It was a very popular piece on the day, still is, a brass band classic. And Branwell Coles wrote to the Chief Secretary in New Zealand and said, this is a fantastic piece of music. Why have we not had anything from Dean Goffin before? And the Chief Secretary wrote back to say, well, you have. You rejected it. You had 2 pieces from him and you didn't want either of them. And so Light of the World was subsequently found again, and the International Music Board allowed for it to be published, this piece that could have been lost because it was rejected from that competition. And there was a note with it that said, the composer shows promise. And The Light of the World became Dean Goffin's first published work in 1951. He followed it up with Shadow of the Cross very soon after that. Symphony of Thanksgiving followed, and then a career of great distinction with writing for the Salvation Army. But so nearly, this piece, which has become such a favourite for so many and has had such an impact on people's lives, was nearly lost because of a technicality.
Fantastic. That's really, really fascinating, some of that background. Certainly I didn't know a lot of that, and especially hearing how the planets had actually influenced Dean Goffin's works. And I guess you can probably hear that in some of his music, that very English tradition, even though he's living on the other side of the world well before the era of Spotify and Apple Music. Before we delve into the score, just another question about this music. Why do you think it is such a significant piece of music within the Salvation Army genre, even though it was written 60, 70 years ago? Why do you think it's so important still today?
Well, I think this is the outline for the modern meditation. And it has remained, as you say, hugely popular. There's a sentimentality through that it's been passed through generations of post-war SA bands people. And I think thousands have been brought to Christ by it. And that would include me. I played this piece at a Salvation Army summer school in the West Midlands in 2007 when I was 15. Led by Gavin Lampley, was the bandmaster of the band that week. And we spent as much time talking about it and the real meaning behind the piece and opening the door of our heart as we did playing it. And that had a real impact on me as a 15-year-old. That was really the week that I gave my life to Christ and subsequently became a senior soldier in kind of the six to 8 months afterwards. But it was directly as a result of this piece. I think the link to the artwork gives it a greater accessibility than many similar works, and there's a lot of extra musical devices used. The knocking motif that we'll talk about is, I think, a link to more of the cinematic modern compositions. Think of writers like Martin Corner, Stephen Ponsford, Dorothy Gates. They're using those same ideas. And we mentioned Holst. Goffin undoubtedly is inspired by Holst in his writing. Yes, that English style, but also that ability that Holst had through something like The Planets to connect with the man on the street, not just the musical aficionado. Goffin could be engaged and transported somewhere else by that piece, and he has done the same with The Light of the World. Goffin spoke of Salvation Army band music, that it was being on a permanent mission to the man in the street. Our band music message must be plain and simple. And I think he achieves that with this piece, but also on another level speaks to the heart as well. It's the perfect combination of the arts with the painting, the brushstrokes, the text that we'll talk about, and the music itself. It's playable, it's not particularly difficult. It's great that it's also been published in the classic series, so you can play it with a band of 5 players, which is brilliant. It's that model for composers today, and it's timeless. I think Lydson said in a letter to Goffin, if you should never write anything more, you will have left your mark indelibly. Even though it was his first published work and he wrote some great music, we talked about the test piece, Symphony for Thanksgiving, he didn't write anything else as significant as this in terms of impacting people's lives.
What a first piece to be published, eh?
Yeah, follow that.
Absolutely. So, shall we delve into the score and talk about the different sections and how the music relates to the Holman Hunt painting that you've mentioned about? I think it would make sense to start at the beginning, don't you?
I think so. So we delve straight into a knocking motif, Jesus knocking at the door, and that's presented in the horns. And so it's solemn and serious stuff from the very beginning. And we hear that motif answered by an upwardly moving euphonium line. Now, that takes us into bars 3 and 4. And these two bars come back again and again. I couldn't find in any of Dean Goffin's notes about this piece, in particular where he was taking that from or what was the significance of it returning. A lot of the additional material is developed from the second tune that we'll come to, which is also significant in Salvation Army history, that there is a second tune in a meditation. And I think that this motif is derived from the second tune. And to me, it's focusing on the idea of sin, and any time that the music seems to be going anywhere, this motif seems to get in the way. And I think it's a motif for sin and the struggles that in our own lives can get in the way of us opening that door and opening our heart to Jesus. So you'll hear that in bar 3 and 4, but then on many occasions through the piece. The first 4 bars then repeat upper tone, and then the final treatment is in the subdominant, before 4 bars in the tonic, pausing on a dominant chord that sets us up for letter A and the first tune that we're going to hear, which is Aurelia.
And the tune Aurelia is set to the words, "O Jesus, thou art standing outside the fast closed door." Of course, a very obvious reference to the painting there. Are you able to share the words for the whole hymn to us, please?
O Jesus, thou art standing outside the fast closed door, in lowly patience waiting to pass the threshold o'er. Shame on us, Christian brothers, his name and sign who bear. O shame, thrice shame upon us, to keep him standing there. Those words are by William Howe, and it's a hymn from 1867. That was actually inspired by a poem entitled Brothers and a Sermon by a Victorian writer called Jean Inglegow. Now, I did look up that poem, and I'd recommend that you don't, because it's very long and not particularly interesting, but you can see the link between the poetry and the hymn. One historian actually thinks that Howe would have also seen Hunt's painting, would have seen the original that's now at Oxford, which could have been further inspiration for these words. And as you say, they're so closely linked to the idea of Hunt's painting, so it's likely he did see it.
Now, those words are perhaps quite old-fashioned language, but what do they mean to you, or what do you take from them?
Well, what's most interesting to me is the use of the word Christian. So there is a suggestion that the person beyond the door has been or proclaims to be a Christian, and yet their heart is closed off to God and they're not opening that door to Jesus in their lives. It's a reminder to me as a Christian that we are sinners too, and that I regularly fail to practice what we preach. And we need to enter into that relationship with the light of the world afresh each day, especially if we want to show God's light in what can be a very dark world.
Thank you for that. So the music then takes us through into section B. What can we notice through this next section? What is there to look out for?
Well, it's very expressive, it's marked as such, and it begins with a cornet and trombone duet. Bramwell Coles in his score notes describes them being in recitative style, and it's like they are speaking aloud their reflections on hearing the knocking, and the punctuation of the knocking motif never goes away. You keep hearing it, and there are swells from piano to forte, and it adds to this feel of struggle that is going on beyond the door for the Christian. Should I open the door to Jesus? Should I give away some control? Dean Goffin, and also later his biographer Cyril Bradwell, spoke of this section being a mirror of his spiritual pilgrimage at that time. He was struggling with doubt. He had a sense of guilt about some of the lifestyle choices he'd made whilst in the military and serving in the Second World War. And he had these competing pathways in his life of musical study. I'm fairly sure that he was one of the first Salvationist composers to obtain a music degree. So he had that pathway going on. But also he was struggling with whether to become a Salvation Army officer. And I think this section and B and C are a musical presentation of that conflict that he believed was inside all of us, and reflects his own odyssey at that time, which is quite validating really, because I think as Christians we need to know that we will go through dark times, and at times we will struggle with our faith. So that's almost reassuring. But the music itself is one of toil and doubt and struggle. The material is derived from a secondary tune that still we've not heard. We've not got to that secondary tune, but that's where it's coming from. When we get to letter C, it's marked passionately, and there is a noticeable upping in the intensity, as first a cornet solo and then some interplay between horn, baritone and euphonium continue what is a more robust reflection at this point. It's somewhat reminiscent of the euphonium upward scale from the opening. I also think, going back to the painting, that B and C appear to represent some of the finer details. You'll see on the painting, and I really would recommend when you're listening to it having it in front of you. It's in a dark wood, it's at the end of the day, and it is perhaps representing the fact that time is running out for that door to be opened. There are weeds growing on the door itself, representing sin, making it harder for us to open the door, because of all those things that get in the way. So I think all of that, and all of our inner turmoil as struggling Christians at times, is represented in letters B and C.
So out of that turmoil and that strife, the music transitions and changes as we move towards letter D. What do you think's happening here in the narrative of the music and the painting?
Well, 6 before D is marked with tenderness. That's really thinking as a conductor here, that's a really tough move, to go from playing with passion on a crescendo and then suddenly this moment of tenderness. And we're modulating from the minor anguish we've been in the previous section, and we arrive at a concert A-flat major chord. So you question why the sudden shift. Well, it's actually preparing us for a second tune, and it's preparing us for the voice of Jesus himself. As Dean Goffin introduces a second song, Fanny Crosby's Behold Me Standing at the Door, and it's a song in which Jesus himself acts as the narrator. Behold me standing at the door, and hear me pleading evermore. Say, weary heart, oppressed with sin, may I come in, may I come in. So we hear that at letter D. The previous recitative section we can now hear was actually derived from this chorus, which is first of all pianissimo in the low horns and the first trombone. So there's tenderness in Jesus' word, but there's passion too. He is pleading with the Christian beyond the door. And that question, may I come in, is asked again and again. The cornets join as we swell into the next section. But before we talk about that next section, it's important to pause and talk about what an important moment this was for Salvation Army music and for the meditation. Introducing a secondary tune to support programmatic ideas inherent in the primary tune. This is entirely new at this point. It's not been done. Eric Ball did it a couple of years later in the piece Sanctuary, and subsequently, because this has become the model for this type of music, many others have done it. Think of a piece like Still by Andrew Blythe that I know you featured on the podcast before. We see again that idea of introducing a second tune to underline the message of the first. Now, we don't know why Light of the World was disqualified from that competition, why it was nearly lost. But I wonder if this had something to do with it. Maybe there was a stipulation that it was a meditation on one tune, and Dean Goffin here was breaking the norm. Maybe it didn't meet their criteria, because this was a real shift, but something that still impacts the writers of today.
Brilliant, thank you for that, and really, again, fascinating to hear some of that background that we wouldn't necessarily know just listening to the piece or hearing it on a Sunday morning. So that takes us into the Dolce just before letter E, that then becomes a little bit more agitated once again. Could you tell us what the message is in this section of the music, please, Jonathan?
Well, this to me feels like decision time for the Christian, and it reminds me of one of the more interesting features of Hunt's painting. Jesus' feet are turned sideways away from the door. And most art historians seem to think the meaning of this is that Jesus has been there for a very long time, as suggested by the dark wood, and he's now preparing to go, the implication being it's almost too late to open the door and admit Jesus into our lives. So here at E, the knocking motif returns, but the tension is rising, and this is aided by an increase in tempo with a poco agitato, but also in pitch as the cornets, horns and baritones continually answer on rising degrees of the scale. And that's recalling the motif of inward struggle featured by the cornet and trombone back at letter B. What I love about this section, though, is that Jesus' knock is constant, refusing to sway away from the purity and stability of a unison concert C. It never moves off that concert C. And there's a reassurance here to the fact that the knocking is unchanging. While the feet may be pointing away from the door, he is still there, still asking, still pleading, despite the Christian, and I include my own, indecisiveness and our sin clouding our judgment. He hasn't gone yet. He stands there as the light of the world, the King of Kings, as he's shown in the painting, wanting to know you and me. And then we reach the climax of the work, a fortissimo, following which we come to what Bramwell calls a hush in his score notes, a much softer knocking motif. And it feels to me at the end of letter E that the Christian has finally made their mind up, as signified by this symbol that takes us into the next section.
So the next section is marked above the score, O Jesus, thou art pleading. What can you tell us about this second iteration of the melody here, Aurelia?
So we've got these words, O Jesus, thou art pleading, in accents meek and low. I died for you, my children, and will ye treat me so? O Lord, with shame and sorrow, we open now the door. Dear Saviour, enter, enter, and leave us nevermore. And we can see it's a verse in which the subject has decided to open the door to their heart and to welcome Jesus, the light of the world, into their life. Interesting to note the repetition of the word enter used by the author, and it almost feels like the pleading has gone from being Jesus to the Christian who is pleading for Christ to come into their life. A beautiful little feature at F is this descant in the cornets. It has its own dynamic directions as well, which just aids the colour, and I think the glory of this presentation is they bring a tenderness. It's like a voice from above, just speaking as we hear the main tune played below.
final section, section G, marked Morendo. Perhaps you could explain what that means and why it is a Morendo moment.
Well, at the start of G, we have the motif from bar 3 and 4 at the start of the piece, which I mentioned, which I think, personally, is a sin motif. But this time, that sin motif is fading away. Rather than growing into it, we're actually starting with it and coming away from it on a decrescendo as part of that morendo that takes us towards the end. And to me, it's as if the sin is dying away as the darkness in the Christian's life is overtaken by light. And actually, Dean Goffin makes it feel lighter as well. He removes the basses for 2.5 bars, so it's got a lighter feel, and he hasn't done that anywhere else. So it just feels lighter as we ease away from that motif. And we end as we started, with the knocking motif. But this time, rather than it being followed by discord, there's resolution, as that upward scale from the euphonium, part of the Christian struggle earlier in the piece, now resolves. I can't remember if it was on this podcast or somewhere else, but I heard Kenneth Downey talk about his piece, Imperfect Peace. And when he was talking about it, he said that to understand and appreciate peace, you need to know hardship. You need to know difficult times. So here we have the very music that took us into sin, tumult, struggle, doubt, and it's used to bring us satisfaction, comfort, peace, and ultimately a relationship with Jesus. There's that resolving of tension, resolving of struggle. We know that happened for Dean Goffin in his own life, but here it happens for the Christian beyond the door as he welcomes Jesus in. And hopefully that can happen for us as the listener too.
So I think it's quite clear to see that what you've spoken about this piece representing and means to you, and I would say to me as well, and I'm sure many of those listening, is not just a message that was prevalent when the piece was written, but actually is something that we can still grasp hold of today. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I feel it's timeless and it's lost none of its relevance. And I think probably on 4 levels actually. Firstly, for Christians, and Dean Goffin clearly, in his choice of songs, saw this as a piece about a Christian who needed to re-accept Christ into their life. I think for Christians, we need to make sure that we're not passive. We need to open the doors to Jesus and to ask him into our lives afresh each day, to shine his light into every area of our lives. We can't say, we don't want you in that part of my life, thank you very much, that's not for you. We've talked about the fact that Jesus' feet were turned sideways away from the door, and that he's been there for a very long time and is being ignored. We need Christians who, afresh each day, are full of light, life, love, rather than the decaying, rotten fruit we see on the forest floor in the painting, that want to keep saying yes and entering into relationship with Jesus afresh. Clearly there is a message for non-believers too. And if you don't know Christ, then you can consider opening your heart to this invitation. And as I played the piece as a 15-year-old, I wouldn't have classed myself as a non-believer, but I probably wouldn't have classed myself as a fully fledged, committed Christian either. And so for me, as a 15-year-old, I wanted to open that door and have Jesus in my life. Holman Hunt himself, we know, was an atheist, but came to faith at around the same time he was painting The Light of the World for the first time. And so he had an opening of the door experience in his own life. And we know, if we look at Scripture, and it's so important to put Scripture in context, if we go a verse further than the inscription into verse 21, we have in verse 20 this knocking, I stand at the door, I'll come right in and supper with you. But the Message translation in verse 21 says, conquerors will sit alongside me at the head of the table, just as I, having conquered, took my place of honour at the side of my Father. That's my gift to the conquerors. So if you're accepting Jesus into your life, you are becoming a conqueror. You are at the head of the table with him. I also think there's a message for us corporately, and I mean as the church, I mean as the Salvation Army, I mean as music groups and bands within the Salvation Army. If we look at the wider context of these verses in Revelation 3 and 14 to 22, that is a vision given by John and addressed to the church at Laodicea, and my apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. We learn from this assessment that that church was lukewarm, smug, self-satisfied. It boasted about its wealth. It had need of nothing, but it was deceiving itself. In terms of its spiritual condition, it was wretched, poor, blind, naked. Jesus urged the church to turn to him as he was positioned outside the church, inviting whoever heard his voice to open the door and welcome him in. And I think we, as the church, as the Salvation Army, as music groups within the Salvation Army, we have to be constantly reflecting on our own churches, on our own bands, on our own groups. Are we welcoming? Are we inviting? Are we open? And more fundamentally than that, is Jesus part of who we are? And that's a question we need to be asking. Lastly, the music. This was a new era for Salvation Army music, as we said earlier, and it has lost none of its significance because it is still the model today for our composers for creating effective meditations. So the message is the most important thing, but this is a really musically significant piece. It's not just a sentimental piece. This is really, really important in our history and how we developed the music in our journals.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing those words and those thoughts and delving into that music to pick out that really poignant message for ourselves and for what we do as Salvation Army musicians there.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. Thank you for all you're doing. It's a fantastic podcast. Really enjoy listening to it, and a real honour and pleasure to be on with you this month.